The United States has a complicated relationship with incarceration. We pride ourselves on freedom and justice, yet we imprison more people than any other nation on earth. Now you might be thinking, well, maybe we're just better at catching criminals, but the truth is far more nuanced and frankly far more depressing. The reality is, incarceration rates in the United States vary wildly from state to state, painting a stark picture of how deeply intertwined the justice system is with factors like crime rates, law enforcement practices, socioeconomic conditions. Today we're diving headfirst into this mess, examining why some states are more likely to put their citizens behind bars. Buckle up, folks, it's going to be a bumpy ride. Let's start with Louisiana, the state that consistently tops the charts for incarceration. Now, Louisiana does have its fair share of crime, but that doesn't tell the whole story. You see, Louisiana has a history of aggressive law enforcement practices, from stop-and-frisk policies that disproportionately target communities of color, to harsh sentencing guidelines that seem to prioritize punishment over rehabilitation. It's almost as if the system is designed to keep people trapped in a cycle of incarceration, rather than offering them a path to redemption. And let's not forget the devastating impact this has on families and communities, ripping them apart and leaving behind a trail of broken lives. Next up, we have Mississippi, a state where poverty and incarceration are tragically intertwined. Mississippi has one of the highest poverty rates in the nation, and it's no coincidence that it also boasts one of the highest incarceration rates. When people are struggling to make ends meet, desperate times can lead to desperate measures. But instead of addressing the root causes of poverty, Mississippi has implemented draconian sentencing policies, including mandatory minimums that rob judges of their discretion and trap people in the criminal justice system for minor offenses. Chapter 4, Arkansas, 3 strikes and you're out of luck. Arkansas is another state that has embraced the tough-on-crime rhetoric, implementing policies like 3 strikes laws that mandate lengthy prison sentences for repeat offenders, even for nonviolent crimes. While these laws may sound good in theory, they often lead to absurd and unjust outcomes, like someone receiving a life sentence for stealing a slice of pizza because it's their 3rd minor offense. It's a system that prioritizes punishment over rehabilitation and ignores the complexities of human behavior. Chapter 5. Oklahoma, where poverty and incarceration collide. Oklahoma, a state grappling with high rates of poverty and limited access to education and job opportunities, has one of the highest incarceration rates in the nation. The correlation between poverty and incarceration is undeniable, as people struggling to survive are more likely to end up on the wrong side of the law. Instead of addressing the root causes of poverty, Oklahoma has adopted a punitive approach to crime, locking people up for minor offenses and perpetuating a cycle of disadvantage. Chapter 6, Kentucky, from coal mines to prison cells. Kentucky, a state once known for its coal mining industry, has seen its economy struggle in recent decades, leading to high rates of unemployment and poverty. As jobs have disappeared, incarceration rates have soared, as people desperate for work or struggling with addiction have found themselves caught in the criminal justice system. It's a tragic example of how economic hardship can fuel mass incarceration. Chapter 7, Texas, big state, big prisons, big problems. Texas, the Lone Star State, has long prided itself on its tough-on-crime stance, and its incarceration rates reflect that. Texas has a history of enacting harsh drug laws, implementing aggressive policing tactics, and building more prisons than any other state in the nation. While Texas has made some strides in recent years towards criminal justice reform, it still has a long way to go to address the systemic issues that fuel mass incarceration. Chapter 8. Missouri, stop and frisk, stop and imprison. Missouri, a state with a history of racial tension and aggressive policing tactics, has one of the highest incarceration rates in the Midwest. The state's reliance on stop-and-frisk policies, racial profiling by law enforcement, and harsh sentencing guidelines have disproportionately impacted communities of color, perpetuating a cycle of poverty and incarceration. Chapter 9. Georgia, a tale of 2 states. Georgia, a state with a complex history and a stark divide between its urban and rural communities, has struggled to address the root causes of crime. While the state has made some progress in recent years towards criminal justice reform, it still has one of the highest incarceration rates in the nation. Socioeconomic disparities, racial bias in the criminal justice system, and a lack of access to education and job opportunities continue to fuel mass incarceration in Georgia. Chapter 10. South Carolina: Mandatory Minimums and the Price of Justice. South Carolina, a state with a long history of racial discrimination and economic inequality, has one of the highest incarceration rates in the nation. The state's reliance on mandatory minimum sentences, aggressive law enforcement practices, and a lack of investment in social programs have created a perfect storm for mass incarceration, disproportionately impacting communities of color and perpetuating a cycle of poverty and disadvantage. Chapter 11. Arizona: The sun also sets on second chances. Arizona, a state known for its scorching deserts and tough-on-crime reputation, has long been a leader in mass incarceration. The state's harsh sentencing laws, including mandatory minimums for drug offenses, have filled its prisons to overflowing, with little emphasis on rehabilitation or reintegration. The human cost of this approach is immeasurable, as families are torn apart, communities are destabilized, and individuals are denied a second chance. Chapter 12. Nevada: Gambling with People's Lives. Nevada, a state synonymous with gambling and entertainment, has a darker side: a high incarceration rate fueled by a combination of socioeconomic factors and punitive criminal justice policies. The state's reliance on incarceration as a solution to social problems has created a vicious cycle, trapping people in a system that often exacerbates the very issues it purports to address. Chapter 13. Tennessee: The volunteer state for mass incarceration. Tennessee, a state with a rich musical heritage and a complex history, grapples with an alarmingly high incarceration rate, driven in part by racial disparities in its criminal justice system. Black Tennesseans are far more likely to be arrested, charged with crimes, and sentenced to longer prison terms than their white counterparts, even when charged with similar offenses. Chapter 14. Florida: The Sunshine State's shadowy side. Florida, the Sunshine State, attracts millions of tourists each year with its beaches, theme parks, and vibrant nightlife. But beneath the surface of this sunny paradise lies a darker reality: a state with one of the highest incarceration rates in the nation. Florida's aggressive law enforcement practices, harsh sentencing laws, and lack of investment in social programs have created a system that disproportionately ensnares the poor, the mentally ill, and people of color. Chapter 15. Ohio: From Rust Belt to Prison Belt. Ohio, a state once at the heart of the nation's industrial might, has seen its economy battered by the decline of manufacturing and the rise of automation. As jobs have disappeared and poverty has risen, so too has the state's incarceration rate. Ohio's reliance on incarceration as a solution to social problems has created a vicious cycle, trapping people in a system that often exacerbates the very issues it purports to address. Chapter 16. Michigan: The state that put America on wheels, now finds itself grappling with the consequences of its mass incarceration policies. Harsh sentencing laws, a lack of investment in rehabilitation programs, and racial disparities in the criminal justice system have created a perfect storm for mass incarceration, leaving communities devastated and families torn apart. North Carolina, a state known for its beautiful mountains and vibrant cities, is also a state marked by deep socioeconomic divides and racial disparities in its criminal justice system. These inequalities are reflected in the state's high incarceration rate, which disproportionately impacts communities of color and perpetuates a cycle of poverty and disadvantage. Indiana, a state often associated with basketball and heartland values, has a less savory side: a high incarceration rate driven by a combination of factors, including harsh sentencing laws, a lack of investment in rehabilitation programs, and racial disparities in the criminal justice system. The human cost of this approach is immeasurable, as families are torn apart, communities are destabilized, and individuals are denied a second chance. Chapter 19. Pennsylvania: The Keystone State of Mass Incarceration. Pennsylvania, the Keystone State, has a long and storied history, but it also has a troubling present: a high incarceration rate that disproportionately impacts communities of color and perpetuates a cycle of poverty and disadvantage. The state's reliance on incarceration as a solution to social problems has created a system that is both costly and ineffective, failing to address the root causes of crime and leaving countless lives in ruins. Chapter 20. West Virginia Mountain High, Hope Runs Dry. West Virginia, a state known for its stunning mountain scenery and close-knit communities, has been hit hard by the decline of the coal industry and the opioid epidemic. These challenges have contributed to a rise in poverty, unemployment, and despair, which in turn have fueled a surge in the state's incarceration rate. West Virginia's reliance on incarceration as a response to social and economic problems has created a vicious cycle, trapping people in a system that often exacerbates the very issues it purports to address. Chapter 21. New Mexico, Land of Enchantment, Lost Potential. New Mexico, a state with a rich cultural heritage and stunning natural beauty, also struggles with a high poverty rate and a lack of economic opportunity, particularly in its rural communities. These challenges have contributed to a rise in crime and a corresponding increase in the state's incarceration rate. New Mexico's reliance on incarceration as a solution to social problems has created a vicious cycle, trapping people in a system that often exacerbates the very issues it purports to address. Virginia, a state steeped in history and home to the birthplace of American democracy, now grapples with the legacy of its mass incarceration policies. The state's history of racial discrimination, coupled with its tough-on-crime laws and aggressive law enforcement practices, has led to a disproportionate number of Black and brown Virginians being caught in the criminal justice system. Illinois, the land of Lincoln, and a state once at the forefront of progressive reform, now finds itself grappling with the consequences of its mass incarceration policies. Harsh sentencing laws, a lack of investment in rehabilitation programs, and racial disparities in the criminal justice system have created a system that is both costly and ineffective, failing to address the root causes of crime and leaving countless lives in ruins. Washington, a state known for its natural beauty and progressive values, also grapples with a high incarceration rate, driven in part by harsh sentencing laws and a lack of investment in drug treatment and mental health services. The state's reliance on incarceration as a solution to social problems has created a vicious cycle, trapping people in a system that often exacerbates the very issues it purports to address.